Senator Back.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. On a day when we honour Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as the longest reigning monarch on the British throne, I want to honour a king, Madam Acting Deputy President, and that is the Cups King, J.B. James Bartholomew Cummings, who died last week. And I wish to thank Senator Lazarus for allowing me to join him in the formal motion that he moved yesterday to recognise the life of Bart Cummings. I knew Bart as a veterinarian in racehorse practice and thoroughbred practice in Melbourne in the early 1970s, and then subsequently as the Western Australian Turf Club veterinarian when he raided the Perth summer carnivals each year. And of course he was an absolute legend of the turf, and I wish to reflect a little bit, if I may, Madam Acting Deputy President, on his record as a trainer, his attitude to the industry and his attitude to the community generally, his sense of humour, and I also want to reflect from a professional point of view why I think he was such a great racehorse trainer. I guess his first major taste came when Comic Court in 1950, the year that I was born. Bred by his father and trained by his father, Jim Cummings won the Melbourne Cup, and Bart was strapping the horse. Interestingly, the horse that ran second to Comic Court was one called Chiquita, and anyone interested in races at Flemington would always know that there's a lodge called Chiquita Lodge, and it's often referred to by race callers as horses past that. In 1965 he won the first of his 12 Melbourne Cups, that was Light Fingers, ridden by the Professor Roy Higgins. And interesting to reflect, Madam Acting Deputy President, that the Melbourne Cup purse for that first of Bart's wins in 1965 was $41,300, and by the time he won his last one with Viewed in 2008, the purse was $3.3 million. When you reflect on the fact that the trainer gets 10% of the winning purse, it gives you an idea of just how increased we saw the prize money in racing. Bart joined with Roy Higgins 2 years later in 1967 when he won on red-handed, and Roy jumped off the horse, and it's reputed that he said to Bart, you know, if you hadn't put me on board and if I hadn't ridden it the way I did, you wouldn't have won the Cups. And Bart said to him, if I hadn't put you on top of the horse and I hadn't trained it as well as I did, you wouldn't have won the Cups. But the second of those wins in 1966 was Galilee, and that was the first of Bart's doubles when he won the Caulfield Cup with Galilee, and then subsequently the Melbourne Cup a couple of weeks later, ridden by our own Western Australian jockey, John Miller. Madam Acting Deputy President, he should have won 13. In 1969, the great horse Big Faloo had won the Caulfield Cup easily, had won the LKS McKinnon Stakes, beating the subsequent winner, Rain Lover, and regrettably, crime was very much a part of the industry at that time, and a strapper had been paid to nobble Big Faloo, and he was given the purgative dancer, and only about 30 minutes before the race the horse was scratched. Rain Lover went on to win that year and the next year. As an aside, as a veterinarian, some time later I had the occasion to be the attendant veterinarian with Big Faloo, and the event of that purgative to him had an absolutely disastrous effect on that particular horse's well-being, and he never ever returned to the greatness that he should have exhibited. In 1974 and 75, Bart won the Cup with Think Big, and I do have to relate the story that that year he had the favourite Leilani, and my mother was visiting us in Melbourne, and I had occasion to be at Flemington on the last fast track work morning before the Cup with my employer, Bill Burns, Dr Bill Burns, and Dr John Burke, with Bart. And John Burke made the point to my mother, Mrs Back, these are two of Bart's horses coming around and one of them is favoured to win the Cup. And Mum very politely turned to Bart and said, well, that horse is working very, very well, Mr Cummings, the one on the outside. And Bart said, no, Mrs Back, he said, that's a horse called Think Big. I think his words were something like, if he started now he couldn't win, we think Leilani will win. So on Cup Day I was there with my mother, and she said, look, I want you to put some money on that horse of Mr Cummings's. And I said, no, Mum. I said, it's favourite Leilani. I said, no point. She said, no, the other horse, that Think Big. And I said, you heard the trainer. He said if it started last Friday it couldn't win. Well, history, of course, records that it did, and the only time it raced again in the next 12 months, it won the Cup the next year. and at track work 2 or 3 days after the Cup, I remember running into Cummings and he said to me, "Is your mother around by any chance, Chris?" He said, "I might need her advice." In 1991 again, Bart won the double with a horse called Let's Elope, and my recollection is that he actually trained and owned Let's Elope. And of course he won another interesting double, the 1996 Cox Plate, which is the major sprint race at Moonee Valley, and backed up a week and a half later to win the Melbourne Cup in that same year. Took the horse to Japan, and unfortunately, whilst it was a red-hot favourite to win the prestigious Japan Cup, unfortunately the horse fell ill and had to be brought back to Australia. And I mentioned Viewed in 2008, and I mention it because those of us who do listen to Australia All Over on a Sunday morning with Ian McNamara would know that Macca always phoned Bart on the Sunday at the racing mass on the Sunday, the 2 days before the Cup after the VRC Derby, and always had a chat with him. And Macca would always say to him, "Well, you know, what have you got running, Bart," etc., etc. And Viewed that year was the bottom weight horse, and I do remember him making the comment something on the lines, "Well, 2 miles is a long way, and if you aren't carrying much weight, you probably will do fairly well." And of course that was the last of his wins. He won 5 Cox Plates, including 2 in 2009 and 10 with a magnificent horse called So You Think. He won over 7,000 races in his career, of which 760, more than 10%, were what are known as stakes races, in other words, a higher quality of race. But I do want to reflect briefly on his sense of humour. Madam Acting Deputy President, as a young trainer in Adelaide, his neighbours were complaining about the number of flies in the stable. The health department came around to tell him he had too many flies, and Bart's response was, "Well, how many am I allowed to have?" On the occasion when an outstanding jockey called Darren Beedman went to Bart, and Darren had found religion, and he said to Bart, he said, "I've spoken to God, and God wants me to give up riding and join the ministry." Bart's response was, "You ought to get a second opinion." It's interesting also too, I remember in the early 70s, reputed that an owner came up to Bart and said, "How much do you charge me to train my horse, Mr Cummings?" And Bart at that time said, "Well, I'll charge you $500 a week if I train it and $1,000 a week if you want to help me." But of course the humour wasn't lost on his family either. His son Anthony, who's also a respected trainer in Melbourne, on one occasion when asked said, "Well, Bart taught me everything I know about training. The unfortunate thing, he hasn't taught me everything that he knows about it." But it's a wonderful industry. There's great senses of humour. On that same vein, I did the veterinary work for George Hanlon. George won Melbourne Cups with Piping Lane, the Tasmanian horse, and of course with Arwan. And Arwan, Madam Acting Deputy President, is the word Nowra spelt backwards. And of course the horse was owned by a group in Nowra. And George was asked by a young journalist, "You know, how important is breeding, Mr Hanlon, to a Melbourne Cup winner?" And of course George said to him, "Son," he said, "it's absolutely critical." He said, "If the horse isn't bred to win," he said, "there's no way he can get 2 miles and win a Melbourne Cup." And the journalist said to him, "Well, what's Arwan's breeding, Mr Hanlon?" He said, "I wouldn't have a clue, son." So it was a great industry to be in. Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to reflect in the last few moments as to why I think the likes of Bart Cummings, Tommy Smith, Colin Hayes were such great were such great trainers. And it's really to do with their capacity to firstly pick a horse that's capable, that can gallop, but more than anything else, over and above other trainers in my observation, was their ability to keep horses eating. They had a great emphasis on the fact that if you couldn't put enough feed into a horse, you couldn't put enough work into the horse, and therefore you couldn't get the horse fit enough. And the other comment I would make about those great trainers is that lesser trainers go into a race with their horse being 90% fit, hoping like hell that it'll have an extra 10%. I think the likes of Bart Cummings probably trained their horses to 110%, hoping that all they were going to need was the 100. Bart was widely honoured. He was a member of the Order of Australia. He was in the Sporting Hall of Fame, one of the inaugural inductees. He won a Centennial Medal. He was an absolute ambassador for our sport and for the industry. And Madam Acting Deputy President, it only remains for me to extend my sympathy and that of colleagues interested, to his wife Valmay, to Anthony and to their family, on the memory of a great man.